So one of the biggest things that most average people, as well as legislators, get wrong is that there's a strong link between mental illness and violence. So we want a convenient way to explain these acts, right? If there's a murder, if there's a mass shooting, we want a convenient way to kind of explain away, okay, this person was mentally ill, right? They had mental illness, that's why they committed these acts. And so, we can wash our hands of it, we know exactly what's going on. But it's not that simple, right? It's definitely not that simple. And a lot of times when you do the research, when you actually look at the literature, what you find is that there's not a strong link between mental illness and violence. In a lot of cases, it's no more common than the average person. So what I always like to think is that we all have capacity to commit acts of violence under the right circumstances. So if you push somebody in the right direction, they may be willing to or feel like they have to commit an act of violence. So that's sort of what we're going to tap into here with the Joker. So the first thing I want to break down is the clip on the laughing. What's going on with the Joker and why is he laughing that way, right? And why does he have this card that says he has some type of, disability or some type of illness, and that this laughing is part of that pathology. Okay. So it's interesting. I think it's really interesting. Now, this is not a psychiatric disorder, but what the Joker actually has here and what they're going for in the film is something called pseudobulbar affect. So you might be wondering, what is pseudobulbar affect? It sounds weird. Yeah, it is a little bit of a strange diagnosis. It's something that's come to light more recently and been more popular in the literature over the last several years. But pseudobulbar affect is an uncontrolled, involuntary laughing or crying that's out of proportion to the event that's going on. And it might be also incongruent, right, with the event. And what I mean by that is it doesn't really match up. Like, you wouldn't laugh at that particular thing, or you wouldn't cry in that particular situation. So let's take that scene, for example, where he's on the bus, the mother's yelling at him, and he starts laughing uncontrollably. Again, it's involuntary, he's laughing, it doesn't really make sense, it's not congruent with the situation. Someone who's getting yelled at by a kid's mother is not necessarily going to start bursting out and laughing uncontrollably. So pseudobulbar affect, how does one get it? Well, a person could end up with this disorder usually by trauma, which we know Arthur Fleck in the film actually has, right? He has a TBI of some sort from his childhood, from the trauma he suffered. Also things like stroke, right? Anything that damages the brain. And also multiple sclerosis, or MS, is another common way that somebody could end up with pseudobulbar affect. Now, there is actually an FDA-approved treatment for this. It's called Nuedexta, and it's a combination of dextromethorphan and quinidine. And if you're wondering why that combination works in this case, that's a great topic for a future video. But for this case, we're going to say the Joker has pseudobulbar affect, and it's more of a neurological disorder and not necessarily a psychiatric. So you might be thinking, Dr. Rossi, how do we know someone's at risk for violence, and what are some of the signs we might be able to look for to see that somebody might be teetering on the edge about to snap? Well, it's difficult. It's always challenging. It's a lot like suicide in that case, right? They ask us all the time as psychiatrists to predict whether or not someone's going to kill themselves, and what you find is it's very, very difficult, and there's not many good objective measures to see whether or not this person is going to commit an act of violence or kill themselves in these cases, right? So what do we look for? Well, we look for things like social isolation, right? Somebody who is isolated, who feels disconnected from society, who doesn't have a lot of social support, that person becomes more at risk. And then you can combine that with a trauma history. So someone who's been physically abused, sexually abused, emotionally abused, severely, that trauma can also increase the risk of violence in rare cases. I want to point out that this is not the common response to trauma, but it can happen, again, given the right circumstances. Just like we said in the first video, people have the capacity for violence. It's just a question of whether or not the right circumstances will present themselves for the person to commit the act. So those are some of the things. Now you combine that with antisocial personality traits, right? This is a person who lacks empathy, doesn't have remorse, is interpersonally exploitive. He's going to do whatever, he or she is going to do whatever they can to get it, what they want from people. They don't really care, and they don't feel bad about it when they do it. Those people also tend to be impulsive and acting in a way that would not be what we would consider ethical, right? So again, the combo: trauma, social isolation, antisocial traits, right? And then the final piece to this is a lack of ability to cope, right? The person is unable to express their anger in a meaningful way and unable to get the help that they need to work through these situations in a meaningful way that's not going to result in violence or something along those lines, right? So the person doesn't have the coping skills and the resiliency factors necessary to deal with their anger, their trauma, and the feelings that they're having. So I wanted to use that final scene in the film where he's kind of like talking on the talk show about the violence that he's committed, and he's telling Murray that he, killed these Wall Street guys and no one would care about him if it was him on the streets lying there dead. So let's break that down, and this is going to get into what I think is actually going on with the Joker and why I think this is less of psychosis or a break from reality and more of what we would term psychopathy, which is not necessarily a DSM-5 diagnosis. So if we think the Joker has psychopathy, right, or he's a sociopath, sometimes this is termed sociopath, psychopath, there's a lot of different kind of interchangeable terms that people will use to discuss these type of people. But let's say he has this psychopathy. What makes it different than psychosis? So psychosis is a break from reality. This is a person who's going to be delusional. This is a person who's going to be hallucinating. This is a person who's going to be disorganized with respect to their speech and behavior, right? They're not going to be thinking clearly. But when you watch this scene with him discussing the murders, what you see is that he's actually very linear and coherent and clear as to why he did it, what his motives were, what he was feeling in that moment, and also displays some of those antisocial traits that we talked about, like the lack of remorse, like a lack of empathy, when he's discussing the murder of these Wall Street people, right? So that's what leads me to believe this is more of a psychopathy and not a psychosis. So what is this psychopathy? It's really a collection of personality traits, really. I mean, that's all it is. It's, again, you will not find this in DSM-5, and you won't find it under the personality disorders either in DSM-5. So it's sort of this diagnosis that's more clinical and based on these traits that may be seen. And those were the things we discussed earlier, things like a lack of remorse, a lack of empathy, the inability to put yourself in another person's position to feel what they're feeling, right? That's extremely important in psychiatry, extremely important in therapy, and there is a group of people out there who are unable to do so. They just don't feel anything. Combine that with impulsiveness, right? And all those other feelings that Arthur Fleck was having during this film, you could say, and also his TBI. You can't negate that fact. And a lot of times with TBI, people become even more disinhibited. So with all those things combined, you can kind of see where this... Alright guys, so I'm going to finish on a little bit of a high note because there's a couple things in the film that actually were pretty good. And the one thing that comes to mind was the scene where he's discussing with the case manager or social worker about funding. And she sits him down and she says, Arthur, funding just dried up. Sorry, the program you were going to doesn't exist anymore. And I think that's a very real scenario for a lot of our patients, and it can be quite frightening. And what are they going to do now, right? This might have been the only thing holding them together. And in some ways, I think that's sort of what the movie was going for, was that this mental health treatment that he was getting was the one thing kind of holding everything together. Without that, he started to kind of fall apart and already, again, had poor coping strategies, wasn't able to really deal with the circumstances that he was dealt. So you see that all the time. It's common in mental health. So we really need to improve funding for all of these programs. And I think we're doing a disservice not only to our patients, but also to the community by not having funding for these things. So with that said, that kind of concludes the breakdown of the Joker film. Hopefully this was interesting. If you like the channel, please subscribe, and we'll continue to make content on all things psychiatry.